What I want to talk about today is what happens if we don't debunk things in real time. What happens if we allow this information to remain in existence with no one trying to debunk it, no one fact checking it, and just kind of believing it? Because what happens is this information becomes history. Remember the first thing we talked about with media literacy. And one of the things we've discussed was the audience negotiates the meaning. If everyone in our audience, like the general population, believes something, then that thing over time will become true. And we will look back in our history books and we will see that what we've created, is actually true. What I want to talk about is the creation of false narratives. Our history is actually quite littered with these narratives that exist that aren't really 100% accurate. One of the examples I can think of off the top of my head, Van Gogh, right? We think about him cutting off his ear. When you do the historical research and you look through the history books, what you actually find is that Van Gogh may not have actually cut off his ear. We look at records from that time. It looks like he had a roommate that was interested in fencing, that they argued quite a lot. And there's a lot of records that suggest that maybe what happened was they got in a fight and his ear got cut off in the fight. And it wasn't kind of this woe is me artist thing that we often think about with Van Gogh. Another one is Paul Revere, right? Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. When you really look through the history, it wasn't one person, right? It was a lot of people going out throughout the country and warning people that this invasion was getting ready to happen. And they wouldn't have been shouting the British are coming. A lot of people at the time would have considered themselves to be British, right? At the time, America was not a thing yet. That's what they were fighting for. They probably would have shouted something more like the regulars are coming. And these are narratives that kind of begin to exist and we believe because they've been told to us over and over again, and they don't really get dispelled, and they kind of become this false history in a way. Another good one is the Napoleon complex, right? Napoleon is supposed to be this very small person, and we get the Napoleon complex, that word, from the fact that he was apparently very small and bitter about it, and so he was very angry. What we really find out when we dig down and do the research is that Napoleon was actually about average sized for a Frenchman at that time. And one of the ways we started thinking he was short was simply because the French, his comrades in arms, called him the little general. It was a term of endearment. But when we look back into history and we see his height, if we don't know the traditional height at that time, he does seem short by today's standards. He was called the Little General. And of course, he is kind of famous for having a bit of a temper. And so you can see why we've created this term Napoleon complex, even though history would seem to make it seem that he's not really short. And that term really doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we go through the history. So these are false narratives that get created when misinformation and misinterpretation allow us to believe something that may not actually be true. So this history kind of gets implanted into what we believe and how we perceive things. And so that's another part of media literacy. Another reason this is so important is because we don't want to create this history that maybe didn't really exist. The other reason this is important, and maybe this is the more important one, is that disinformation, so that more nefarious type of information, is very dangerous. It has been used by dictatorships across the world to keep their public confused. When we really look at disinformation, most of the time the point of it isn't that you believe it, it's that it could be true. And because it could be true, you start questioning what is true. And their hope is that you get confused. Because if you're confused, then you won't attempt to kind of continue down the path of figuring out if this is true or not. You will settle into what's known as reality apathy, where you just kind of accept whatever reality the government tells you. This is why dictators become powerful. Their population doesn't really know what's true and what's not true, right? They aren't sure if this is real or if this isn't real. And because of that, the government at the time can begin pushing laws and their agenda that makes it more authoritarian or kind of whatever way that leader likes that government to be run. And because of that, suddenly they are now over this entire population, running it any way they see fit with really no pushback from the public because the public themselves, they don't really know what's going on. They're confused. So rather than push back, they just accept whatever's kind of given to them. And if we push this way out to the extreme, there's this theory that was pushed on BuzzFeed about what's known as an information apocalypse. It was an interesting story written a couple of years ago. I'll link to the story here. I've edited some parts of it out because some of it went into some stuff that we probably shouldn't be getting into at school. But I left in all the really important elements of this story about the information apocalypse and why this is so important to think about and where society could head if we push it to the most extreme form of no one really being media literate and fake news and fake information running amok. So read that story, then come back. Okay, hopefully that didn't scare you too much. The first time I read it, it kind of frightened me a little bit. So what I would like you to do now is there is a link provided on the Google Slides or the PDF, depending on which version you're using, that is right there attached for you to go to. And on this link are some studies that have been done this year or in the past 2 years about kind of this disinformation that exists. And I want you to follow the directions on that one section. There'll be 5 questions for you to answer. I think you only need to read like 2 studies and then answer those following questions. And hopefully this lesson has really hit you in a way that makes you understand how important this is. When we come back for the next lesson, we're going to start working towards a more positive thing. How do we fight this, right? How do we stop the kind of darkest timeline from occurring?